Welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. Today we have someone, Tro, that kind of rocked my world. That I heard her on Peter T, and I thought, oh my gosh, if she's right, I'm like, I have to do some backpedaling and talk to my patients again. So Tro, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I'm really excited for this. We have the esteemed Katherine Eban. She's an investigative journalist. It's funny. They keep showing us doctors up. They keep exposing truths that we should be knowing about. She studied at Brown and Oxford. She's written for the New York Times. She's written for Vanity Fair, and her book, The Bottle of Lies, which I highly recommend every single patient, every single person, every single doctor read, was absolutely riveting. I was literally, I couldn't stop reading it. I had to finish. I had to see what happened next. And it's about the gaps in the regulatory environment dealing with generic drugs, and completely opened my eyes. So happy to have you here. So happy to have you talk about this book, this amazing work that you did. And again, Brian, we have investigative journalists who are showing us up.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be on with you. And, only an investigative journalist would be crazy enough to spend 10 years reporting on this topic. So there you have it.
Well, it's funny. We've also had Nina Teicholz on. We've had Gary Taubes, and it is your work. And I put you right up there with them. It is your work that has really shaped who we trust, what we think, because I have to be honest, Brian, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to walk you back to about 5 years ago, or maybe 7 years ago. 7 years ago, I was a practicing, board certified internal medicine doctor, probably one of the biggest prescribers of generic drugs in my community, right? Because it's cheaper, and I believed it was as effective, right? And if you look at the FDA guidelines that say, they have to demonstrate 90% of the, ingredients have to be in the blood at the same time, and I would tell patients when they came to me and said something's off, something's wrong, this isn't working, right? When they took antibiotics, or when they took thyroid medication, or when they took a new formulation and said, all of a sudden I have allergies, I would always say, no, it's the same, it's made with the same ingredients. That was my response. And in fact, I would say, not that I thought that it was placebo effect, that maybe I thought it was placebo effect, maybe I thought it was nocebo effect. I just dismissed them. I dismissed them, and I know better now, having seen so many things unravel, but that's the doctor I was, and that's not the doctor I'm now. And I have you to thank for. So we'll start with that. And then how did you get started? How did you go from being a journalist, looking into the CIA and, all these other things, investigative journalism, to wait a second, there's something really wrong here, and I have to show this story.
Yeah. So, a lot of the big investigative projects begin with a tip. They begin with a phone call. And the same was true for me. It was in 2008. I got a phone call from Joe Graydon. He runs a radio program on NPR called The People's Pharmacy. He had been getting flooded with phone calls from listeners and emails who were complaining about their generic drugs. These were patients who had been stabilized on brand name drugs, and then they were switched to a generic at the pharmacy. And suddenly their symptoms were no longer in control. They felt strange side effects. And he's a trained pharmacologist. He believed what they were telling him. So he took those complaints to the FDA, and officials there basically told him it's probably psychosomatic, that, if patients' pills change color, change shape, then they think they're not being helped. But Graydon did not believe that. And he put this question to me: what is wrong with the drugs? And it was a question that I could not get out of my head. It's just how I'm wired. I wanted to know what is wrong with the drugs. So I started looking into FDA standards, and you had pointed to a couple of them, the bioequivalence standards. So the FDA recognizes that generic drugs can never be an exact copy. They're a version. And as a version, they create this standard, which says, you have to use the same molecule, and it has to be absorbed into the blood not more than 20% above, or not more than 25% above or 20% below the absorption into the blood of the brand name drug, right? And then they impose a confidence interval on that brings it a little closer into the middle. Still a range, right? I mean, it could be quite a big range. The generic companies can use different excipients. Okay, so that all seemed like strange, but I learned something that really made me think that I was onto a red flag, which is the FDA, contrary to what many people think, they don't actually test the drugs that they approve. What they do is they review the company's data, right? In order to make an approval. So I went down, and this was, back in 2008, 2009, I was doing my reporting, and I went down to the FDA's office in Silver Spring, Maryland, and sat around a conference table with a bunch of federal officials, including the head of the FDA's Office of Generic Drugs. So he says this to me: the approval system requires the ethical behavior of the applicant. Otherwise, the whole house of cards will fall down. And I was like, whoa, they are approving these drugs on an honor system, right? And, if you know anything about reporting on pharma, that's not a very good standard for approval. So that's really what kind of catalyzed my reporting on this.
I think one of the things that that people face, and I face this now. I've gone from the standard cookie cutter approach to evidence-based medicine to now questioning a lot of things, right? And this book helped me do that. And what I took away most from your book was, at every level of some of these generic drug companies, and we shouldn't really limit it to generic drug companies, because we've seen scandals at branded drug companies and new pharma, big pharma, but there were multiple levels of unethical behavior, and it was almost systematic, right? Unethical behavior, and it's like everybody knew it. I mean, you outlined how they started, I guess maybe they were trying to compete to get drugs in Africa. They were trying to get cheap antibiotics worldwide, and maybe there was noble benefit somewhere, who knows? But everyone from the scientists to the management to the CEOs knew what was going on, didn't care, and looked the other way. And the people that are supposed to protect us in the United States, the people that are the FDA, whose job it is to protect us, basically said, well, we're going to let them decide and tell us if what they did is actually, up to code. I mean, it is a riveting tale of how corrupt these huge multinational corporations are. And so how did you, I want to understand the process, because this is going on over 10 years, and it's like peeling, you gave us the whole onion.
Yeah.
But you were peeling these onions. Like, first it was a couple of, complaints from patients. Then it was a couple of whistleblowers. Then it was a ton of emails. Then it goes all the way up the chain. And then also, so what was it like, uncovering this onion of corruption, I guess?
Yeah. So this kind of reporting is really painstaking. And as you've described, you build it little by little. But, I started out with an article that I published in Self magazine, which basically, and that came out in 2009, and that was basically documenting the problems that Joe Graydon had alerted me to, which were, hey, there are all these patients who go on these like medical odysseys to try to figure out what is wrong with them because suddenly they have all these weird symptoms. And then they realize, oh, well, wait a second. Those all started when I went for a refill at my pharmacy and I got switched from one manufacturer to another, from a brand to a generic or from one generic to another. And I was also able to document concerns from doctors, particularly doctors who prescribe narrow therapeutic index drugs, so where precise dosing is super important. The neurologists, endocrinologists, cardiologists, psychiatrists, they were concerned. And some of the medical societies had published kind of guidances to their members saying, this is something you need to think about. But, after I published that article, I was pretty unsatisfied because I am somebody who likes to get to the bottom of things. And I was like, well, I've documented that there is a problem, but what is the problem? What is wrong with the drugs? So it was about a month after I published that article and I got an email from somebody calling himself $4 refill, which is what you would pay to fill, a generic prescription at a Walmart. And he was inside of the generic drug industry. And he basically said to me, look, if you want to get to the bottom of what is wrong with the drugs, you need to look at where they're being manufactured, which is largely overseas in India and China. So at that point, I was like, all right, I'm an independent journalist sitting in Brooklyn. I don't have a foreign office. I don't have a foreign desk. I don't have colleagues overseas. I don't have sources overseas. How am I going to do this? And I just started reporting in the US, and I heard about a company called Ranbaxy. At that time, it was India's largest drug company. It was the fastest growing generic company in the US. And even if, people listening to this podcast say, well, I've never heard of that company. If you were one of the millions of Americans in 2011 who celebrated when Lipitor went generic and you got generic atorvastatin, you were taking Ranbaxy's drug because they had what was called a first to file or an exclusivity to come out with the first generic of that drug. Ranbaxy made $600 million in 6 months from coming out with that generic. But I began to hear that the FDA was looking into the question of whether Ranbaxy had faked some of its quality data. In other words, that data that comes into the FDA on an honor system, were they altering some of that data to make their drugs appear better than they were? And that was really where I picked up the first glimmers of a serious scandal.
And I think what happens next is basically so riveting. I mean, we're talking about, this is like modern times. This isn't like the 1980s. This isn't like the 1960s. When I'm reading your book, it's like this dystopian regulatory environment. I'm imagining like 1980, I'm imagining like, for me years before, but, before I was a doctor, before I was in medical school. But it's like, this is now.
Yeah.
Right. And the first thought I had, so you really highlighted the corruption the entire way. Okay. From the local plant operators and local people to hotels in the areas where the FDA, regulators would come in to inspect. I mean, like, it is a network of corruption all the way up to middle management, CEOs, and maybe even the FDA. You kind of hinted at some people in the FDA who later went on to work in consulting firms. And so it's like widespread corruption. And the first thought I had was, is it just Ranbaxy? Or is it everybody? What about TiVo? What about, what about all these other generic, what about the American generic? What about, all these companies are doing, buying generic drug companies now if they don't, or or either selling them or acquiring them. How widespread is the falsification of data?
Right.
Yeah.
So in 2013, when I'd been reporting on this topic for, at that point, almost 5 years, I published a 10,000-word article in Fortune magazine, which told the whole story of what had happened inside Ranbaxy. This whistleblower, Dinesh Thakur, who had risked his life to bring detailed information and documents to the FDA about the falsification, widespread falsification of quality data inside Ranbaxy that affected more than 200 products in more than 40 countries. So a global crime on behalf of Ranbaxy that affected millions of patients who got generic drugs that were not what they purported to be, essentially. But then, the obvious question was, well, is Ranbaxy just this freakish outlier, like the most corrupt drug company in the history of the world? Or is this something about how the industry operates, right? Is it widespread that generic drug companies are literally undercutting their own products for profit? Are they making the cheapest drugs possible and selling them into the most regulated markets possible with false data in order to get approval? So I was about maybe a couple of months into reporting on that when I got contacted by another person who became a source. This was an FDA consultant who had a very interesting point to make. She said to me, I'm so glad that you are finally reporting on the issue of what she called fast drugs, which is, she said, just like the issue of fast food or fast fashion. So what did she mean? If you go into the Gap and you buy a cheap pair of pants, as we all have done, I think most consumers understand, why are those pants cheap? They're cheap because we understand they're made in a sweatshop overseas with suboptimal employment conditions and probably manufacturing shortcuts and low quality textiles. But she basically said to me, the same thing is happening in the pharmaceutical industry, which is you have these pharmaceutical sweatshops overseas where there are outrageous shortcuts, terrible employment conditions, terrible sanitary conditions. And these are the plants where our low-cost drugs are being made. So I began digging into that, and I discovered something really kind of critical to all of this, which is that in the US, when the FDA inspects a manufacturing plant, it doesn't give advance notice that it's arriving, right? The investigators show up unannounced. They show up at a plant, they stay as long as is needed, they inspect. But overseas, because of the problems with logistics, the FDA was giving these manufacturing plants months of advance notice that they were coming. So what were these manufacturing plants doing? They were, as I ultimately uncovered, literally sending in data falsification teams to come in, shred documents, alter documents, invent documents. They would literally create standard operating procedures to look like they were compliant, and then they'd steam those documents overnight in a sauna-like room to make them look old. I mean, the levels of falsification, the FDA would show up at what are called aseptic plants, which have to be, kept sterile in rigorous conditions. And they would show up, and it turned out the data was perfect. The plants were aseptic, except they weren't testing anything. There were no samples, and all the data was fake. It was all made up. You know, there were lizard infestations, snakes, monkeys, pigeons, you know, documents being discarded into rivers, fake active ingredients being stored in secret above ceiling tiles. I mean, the levels of deceit were extraordinary. And this is essentially what the FDA had signed us all up for by announcing these inspections in advance.
And then the inspectors were also wined and dined, and they say, okay, you're our friend, you treat us great, so yeah, we don't have to look at all this documentation.
Right, well,
some
that's
of them,
right.
yeah.
So incredibly, the FDA, and now since my book came out, they changed this policy, they would ask the manufacturing plants to arrange local ground transportation and hotel rooms. So the FDA investigators would, you know, land in Hyderabad and be met by luxury vehicles, taken to hotel rooms where their rooms were upgraded. They'd never see a bill, taken out to fancy dinners, taken to the Taj Mahal, shopping trips, golf outings, gold coins. I mean, you name it. So this was the honor system on which our generic drugs were being inspected.
Yeah,
You know,
I think I'll go ahead.
no,
Jim.
go ahead, Brian.
You know, for me as a doc, you know, sitting back, we saw some falsified studies being printed in our most prestigious journals with no like background checks. No one said this isn't real data. And you see how these things happen, and it's so disheartening because for us, Tro and I are looking at that patient in front of us, and we want to do the best thing for them. Unfortunately, we're given bad advice. We have studies that are fraudulent that all these doctors are quoting, even when it's proven fraud, absolutely fraudulent. They're still quoting the studies, and it's once it's out there, it's out there.
Yeah.
And it's such a hard. It's so hard for the frontline doctors, and I think there's so many doctors who just say, "Well, the science says this." Well, the study was falsified that you're quoting. It's not a real study. It was never on real people, and
Right.
it's so disheartening that investigators had to go out and like. No one else is concerned about this, it seems.
You know, after 2 decades of investigating in the pharma and health space, you know, I think I can say conclusively that the honor system does not work. It never works. It's ineffective. Now, one of the FDA investigators I feature in the book, a guy named Peter Baker, he was just sort of the Pablo Picasso of FDA inspections. He figured out that instead of going into these manufacturing plants and asking them to print out data, he looked inside the computer systems. And once he did that, he discovered this whole subterranean world of secret testing, whereby the plants would pre-screen their drugs, figure out that they wouldn't pass specifications. Then they would go into the software systems and they'd alter the parameters of the test so that once they retested the drugs, they passed with flying colors. Then they would delete the pre-tests, right? So that there was no trace of them when the FDA came in, except that Peter Baker was able to find the metadata that was still there from those pre-tests. So by doing this, he found fraud literally in 4/5 of the plants that he inspected in India and China. So, you know, to the question of how widespread is this? I mean, he inspected 86 plants in India and China and found evidence of fraud in 4/5 of them. So, you know, once I got to that, I was like, well, I think I'm beginning to close here on the answer to Joe Braden's question, what is wrong with the drugs?
Yeah, and that's, you know, along those lines, you know, I had a patient, you know, a certain drug, a generic, she said, you know, when I take the blue one, it's perfect. When I take the pink one, it doesn't work. And she knew, and like her thyroid would be off and different and it's incredible. I'm thinking, is it the dye? What is it? You know, why is it that she has only have this manufacturer and it works? And then, you know, after you came out and started talking about this, I'm like, maybe one manufacturer was legitimately doing what they were supposed to do and the other one wasn't.
Oh yeah. You know, as this FDA consultant said to me, every consumer knows if you go out to buy cheddar cheese, right? You know that there is a difference between Cheese Whiz, Velveeta, and artisanal cheddar. right? Every consumer knows that, but like, do they understand that if you go to the drugstore and you're getting, you know, Ranbaxy generics versus Teva generics, you know, versus Sandoz, that there are differences there too. And of course, how could a consumer know that? But it's the, you know, cheddar cheese principle.
I want to expand a little bit beyond pharmaceutical, generic drugs, because, and maybe you can help me understand this, cultures of fraud and cultures of, because I think really all you would need you have to be really rotten to the core to have an entire organization do this. I mean, it has to be a true culture of fraud. And then you need a regulatory environment that accepts that, right? So you need two different parts here. And Dr. Lenskis, Brian, he was talking about a lot of things that we've seen, over the past just several years. There was an excellent book called Emperor's Drugs, where somebody had to literally use the Freedom of Information Act to look at the FDA trials for antidepressants to see if they were even effective. This fraud that he mentioned in the New England Journal of Medicine, in the Lancet, that dealt with Surgisphere, who literally fabricated data. Okay, so, and these are accepted in the most prestigious journals. And even recently, just recently, okay, we had Dr. Damasi and Dr. Thomas Jefferson write an article, I mean, it was just several days ago in JAMA Internal Medicine, talking about branded pharmaceuticals using quote unquote inert placebos, but then keeping the contents of those placebos completely confidential, refusing to document them, refusing to release what is in them. And they talked about one drug, which was, a prescription grade fish oil that seems to show some efficacy. It was compared against mineral oil, right? So, and it made me think, wait a second, these are people here who I think the same way you did, which is, how are people taking advantage of our regulatory system for profit? Can we put in some different placebo? Can we use the fact that these drug applications at the FDA, in the case of the SSRIs, are confidential, they're considered, proprietary information, these drug applications, right? And can we use those to our advantage? And I don't think the average American thinks that way, that there are these people, these companies from top to bottom, that are literally thinking, how can I take advantage of the situation for financial benefit? We look at, emergency use authorization of, let's just say, let's take COVID, right? I mean, COVID has probably created a scenario where regulations have gone out the door.
Oh, we know that for an absolute fact. I mean, in the height of the hydroxychloroquine craze, the FDA was like, we need these active ingredients for this malaria drug, which turned out to have really no benefit for COVID sufferers. We need these active ingredients. What are we going to do? And they looked around the world, and there was this plant in Pakistan that had never been inspected by the FDA, and in fact had so many problems that even the Pakistani regulatory authorities were like, nope, this place is a mess. And the FDA was like, awesome, we'll take millions of chloroquine pills from that uninspected plant in Pakistan to put into the strategic national stockpile. I actually exposed that. I was able to interview the Pakistani inspector who went into that plant on the basis of a whistleblower allegation. But it's like, if your system does not work well in a non-emergency situation, and then you have, a category 5 hurricane like COVID, what happens to your system? It doesn't improve it.
Yeah, and I think that places us doctors in a tough predicament. There are so many amazing therapies that have been approved for COVID. And a lot of times people ask me and I say, like my mom, I'm just going to give you an example. My mother, who's elderly,
She's not elderly, Tro.
She's not elderly, but
very
she's
young.
older.
I know
she's
mom
young.
listens.
She's a listener and she's got diabetes. I'm like, Mom, go take the vaccine. Go take it. You're most likely to benefit, And then I have my 9-year-old son who's asking me, Tro, doesn't say that. He says, Baba, he says, should I take the vaccine? He just asked me, he's suffering. He's going through all this, the school closures, and he's asking me. And I'm like, I don't know, like emergency use authorization. I don't know. And the problem is as a doctor, we rely on authorities.
Right.
And what you've shown me is not that I can't trust the authorities. I can't trust anybody. I can't trust the companies. I can't trust the authorities. I have to do my best to verify as best as I can to give my best judgment for my patients. And
Right.
what really made me really worried about your book was not about just Ranbaxy. Okay? Somebody bought Ranbaxy.
Right.
Somebody knew what the hell. I mean, if you're buying a major company.
Right.
So when I saw that, and when you talked about that in your book, I'm like, this isn't an isolated problem.
Right.
Everybody knows what's going on.
Right.
And that's really what scared me because, look at what I just brought up. We're talking about Surgisphere fraud. We're talking about, pharma companies using these, non-disclosed placebos. We're talking about having to use Freedom of Information Act to do meta-analyses on unpublished trials. We're talking about generic drug companies. I'm left as a primary care doctor saying, who do I trust?
Yeah. The problem is companies will do whatever they can get away with. One of the things that I uncovered, something that is very common in the generic drug industry is called Dualtrack Production. Okay, so what that essentially means is that they will adjust the level and quality of manufacturing depending on the market they're shipping into. So Lipitor for the US is probably going to have their, best safeguards. Lipitor for Africa, or what they call rest of world markets, ROW markets, is going to be the lowest quality ingredients, the most manufacturing shortcuts. Literally, the manufacturing standard is whatever you can get away with. So, our problems stemmed from the fact that the FDA was making it easy for them, right? Our companies were moving their manufacturing plants thousands of miles away. The FDA was approving foreign companies to come in. And let me tell you, like, if a drug is made 7,000 miles away from our regulators, it does not improve its safety, right? So at this point, the FDA has more manufacturing plants to inspect overseas than it does within the US. That is kind of at the core of our problem.
Well, it seemed like for a while there, it was like every week they go, this drug, there's a contaminant that could cause cancer. This drug, there's a contaminant. Like I remember thinking, okay, like I would switch it for this drug to that drug. Then they said that now there's a problem with that generic. Then there was flecks of metal or whatever was in it. Cleaning agents they were using that could cause cancer, whatever. It was
MDMA, BPA, everything.
Yeah, all this stuff, and it's incredible. Like no one's like after it's on the market, you've already taken it by then.
So the valsartan, losartan scandal. So in 2017, an FDA investigator goes into this plant in China and is like, they are not investigating the impurity spikes in their own drugs. Like they're not following standard operating procedures or good manufacturing practices. So that investigator recommended to the FDA what's called official action indicated, right? So the investigators recommend a sort of sanction or seriousness of what they find. Official action indicated is the most serious. But at that point, the bureaucrats in Maryland were like, nope, we think this is just going to be voluntary action indicated, meaning, yeah, there's an issue here, but the company fix it on their own time. 1 year later, that plant was in the middle of a worldwide scandal because NDMA, which is, you know, a byproduct of liquid rocket fuel, was found in those that active ingredient for blood pressure medication, you know, and then it just sort of spread from there. But literally, the FDA essentially turned a blind eye to what its own investigator had found.
When we've seen this as a problem, you know, Tro and I know, just looking at the low carb realm, we're low carb keto people, and a lot of the studies they do are fraudulent studies in the fact that they're using very toxic oils that we don't recommend to people. We're recommending olive oil, and they're using soy and canola oil in their study. So the study is poor from the very beginning, but then the headline says, oh my gosh, everyone's going to die because these mice got sick from this diet. Or, you know, they'll try to disprove a drug. So they use a huge, like 4 times or one of them was like 30 times what the standard, like you're doing a study and you don't know what the dosage is for the medication. And so I think there's so many things that are looking to give you a false impression that a drug is toxic when it's not, or it's safe when it's not. And it's hard because, you know, the numbers, as you know, the pharma uses aren't representative of the actual impact it's going to have on your health as an individual.
You know, I was struck by something that this African pharma consultant had said to me in the course of my reporting, which is, you know, essentially all drugs are poisonous except under the most controlled conditions. And that's what pharma manufacturing is supposed to be, the most controlled conditions. So it's governed by very detailed good manufacturing practices, you know, that everybody has to follow. But one of the things is the FDA likes to talk about a culture of compliance, that they are essentially just showing companies the way. This is how to do it. This is what we advocate. And companies, it's up to you to make sure that you comply. You know, once you've really kicked the tires of the FDA, that's not all that reassuring.
I think the other problem, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think the other problem is, you know, now what do we do with this information? You know, I'm a primary care and weight loss oriented doctor. I have a patient who comes in with thyroid disease. Okay, he's taking a thyroid medication, right? And, you know, if you say, you know, branded only, right, on the prescription, the insurance companies fight you. It'll take me 4 hours worth of phone calls to have that happen, because I cannot rely, right? I mean, how do I hear your, you know, your story, the work that you've done, and go on and not at least be cognizant of what's going on? I think, you know, this is where I struggle as a doctor. Like, I'm left with, you know, I don't want to go so far off the end where I'm, you know, very conspiratorial. At the end of the day, I have to help the person in front of me. So I have to trust some systems.
Right.
But how do I reconcile all this info? It's like there's widespread problems in the pharma and generic drug industry, the regulatory environment. There's widespread problems. And at the end of the day, you know, I'm going to have a patient with meningitis in the hospital, like you talked about in your book. I'm going to have, you know, a patient with thyroid disease that comes and sees me. You know, what do I do? And this is where I'm struggling with.
Right. You know, as I have gone around and talked about my findings, and I've addressed audiences of doctors, and every time I speak to doctors, I have this uncomfortable feeling like doctors are so overwhelmed. So much is asked of them. So do I really want to be the person saying, hey, everybody, there's something else you have to think about that you haven't thought about before? So I feel like the bearer of bad news. But unfortunately, that is true. So in Bottle of Lies, I tell the story of Dr. Harry Lever, who is a cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic. And he began to really understand the differences for his patients in different manufacturers, right? He really sort of made a study of this, tunneled deep into the drug supply, did all of this research. And, you know, he began to feel that one of his jobs as a doctor was to diagnose the drug supply. Not just to diagnose his patients, but to diagnose the drug supply. So, you know, he began to recognize, hey, when my patients are switched to this manufacturer of a drug, they do poorly. And I can't just assume that they're on the wrong medication. I have to look into whether they're on the wrong manufacturer of that medication. It was because of his efforts that the Cleveland Clinic began to realize that their heart transplant patients were suffering organ rejection when they were switched to a specific Indian manufacturer of an immunosuppressant. I mean, how harrowing is that? You give somebody a $1 million heart transplant and they do great, and then they're switched to a low-cost generic with the insurance company saving a few bucks, and they wind up back in the ICU. So literally, the Cleveland Clinic was figuring that out because of his efforts.
Yeah, and it's such a hard thing for us frontline docs because of that. Like, we don't want to be conspiracy theorists and say all pharma's bad, because people get that impression of us because we're taking people off of meds.
Right.
It's not an issue anymore. When I have a lady, we just stopped 3 meds yesterday. It's like, awesome. That takes the generic brand name question out of it, but we're trying to save money for our patients and doing it in a cost-effective way. But as an example, one of my patients had a blood clot, and the medication is a brand name only. And it was like $1,200 a month. He said, I just can't afford it. I'm paying $800 out of that. So he went to Canada, and he goes, if I get it from, and it's the same brand name drug. I don't know if it is. It could be black. I don't know. Right. So that was my question for you. He said, is it safe or not? I was like, man, you're risking your life. I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. If that's just because it says it's that name, could it be that they're fraudulently selling stuff that's not real?
Well, yeah. My first question is, did he actually go to Canada to a brick and mortar pharmacy, or did he buy Canadian drugs over the internet? And if you buy Canadian drugs over the internet, there's usually some fine print that says, if we don't have the relevant drug in stock, you authorize us to obtain it from our offshore partners. And let me tell you, you never want to take a pharmaceutical that has come from an offshore partner, wherever that might be. So I am the reporting I'm doing is on how messed up the legitimate drug supply is. You talk about internet drugs, and it's like, forget it.
Yeah, it's really a tough one. Yeah, go ahead, Tro.
No. I mean, you bring up a great point. It's like, how far down the rabbit hole you go. Like, you're faced with this real world patient who's paying for an expensive drug, and here he has like a Canadian drug that's cheaper. You want to be able to say yes, but it's like, if you continue down the rabbit hole, how do you trust them? How do you trust the Canadian regulatory environment? Where do they get it from? And then Brian, you mentioned that we deal with patients who, the patients that are coming to us, they're highly interested in coming off like the insulin that they don't need. If they can change their diet, lose weight, they have blood pressure medications that they don't need. They don't want the losartan tainted with, MDMA. They don't want the, metformin tainted with BPA. They don't want these things if they can, achieve it through lifestyle. And there's certain things that we can't do. If your thyroid is shot, your thyroid is shot, and if you need thyroid hormone, you may need thyroid hormone. So we have to rely on it. The other end of it, which we haven't really talked about, is this whole supplement industry, which, I mean, it's such a, if the prescription drugs that are more tightly regulated are so corrupt, and, you basically can't trust it, right? What does that say about the supplement industry? And Brian, I'm sure you've seen, often do we get a patient that comes in with a list of 12 supplements, and you're just like, what do I do? What do I do?
Especially if it doesn't make a difference and they're not feeling better, it's like, what are you doing? Right? At some point.
I have, after all of this reporting, I've come to the conclusion that you basically never want to ingest something that is coming from a manufacturing plant that has never been inspected by the FDA. Because given what's going on in the plants where they do inspect, imagine what is happening in the plants that they don't inspect. And I have seen pictures of those plants, and they're harrowing. So, that's where you're talking about supplements, supplement manufacturing. I mean, the stuff that is going on in some of those plants, which are minimally regulated, is really shocking.
If it's
Yeah,
within the United States, is it more likely to be okay, or is it still not regulated?
I would say, so in my experience, the things that keep companies compliant and keep their standards high is the threat of an unannounced inspection. Nothing motivates, legitimate manufacturing like that risk. The risk of an inspector walking in unannounced and with power to shut down your manufacturing. That's where you get compliance. And even that's not perfect. But you take away that threat, right? It can be deadly.
Tro, I'm sad to say this, but maybe we can start having people type in some questions, because we only have, Katherine has a hard out in about 12 minutes. So we'd love to have our Patreons be able to ask some questions on this stuff. And, while you're doing that, Tro, for me as a doc with COVID, it really hit home, because I'm on the campus of a school. So I said, look, I want to test where I can test asymptomatic people to make sure if they got exposed that they're not getting exposed to the rest of the school. No test on the market. However, they're mandating if you want to travel and you're asymptomatic, you still need to get testing. I've seen a ton of false positives on the testing, right? Where people got retested negative. They spent $2,000 on testing. So I met with the manufacturer, and the manufacturer says, wink, wink, nod, nod. Doctor, you get paid every time you do a test, right? And it's mandated by the government. Well, it's a test that's useless. It's useless if you're asymptomatic. It's useless. There's no benefit, because if you just got exposed yesterday, the test is going to be negative. So you have a false negative, false positive, I don't know. The test doesn't mean anything. But if you're symptomatic, now all of a sudden I can look and go, okay, this is not COVID. Or if you want to go back to work, I could say you're no longer infectious, right? So I think there's we're really in a terrible era where people lose their ethics and they just want to make a few bucks. And they'll test everyone in the world. Bring all your neighbors and friends and we'll test everyone, because they get paid every time they do that. And it's really, really tough.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is, Brian, is when emergencies happen, when you're trying to get drugs worldwide, it seems like the idea here is regulation goes down, and when regulation goes down, I don't think it's great for our patients. I think that's the bottom line here, right?
Yeah. If there's one lesson from this pandemic, it is to stick to the science, even if you're in the middle of a crisis, the building's on fire, the regulations and the standards guide you. And that needs to be remembered.
And that in itself, what I've seen during this pandemic more than anything is people who speak science and truth and that know their numbers and they're looking at data, they get ridiculed and mocked. Yeah. I've seen it over and over, because it doesn't fit the narrative. But if you look and say, look, what are your odds of dying? Let's look at your risk factors. Let's look at what your odds of dying of this condition are. Mm-hmm. Because the perception is everyone who gets COVID dies. And when you look at the data, that's not what it shows, right? Unless you're in a certain category, immunocompromised, sick, morbidly obese, diabetic, low vitamin D, all these things that we know, yet we're not pushing those things. The metabolic health, that's what Tro and I do. So I see patients, their 3-month sugar average used to be 10, now it's 5. They've decreased the risk of dying significantly just by taking lifestyle interventions and even coming off meds. So it's frustrating, because there's stuff we can do to really help people, but it's not common knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have one question. Well, actually, you know what? Maybe I'm going to take this question. It comes from Vic, one of our longtime kind of supporters. I'm going to kind of twist it a little bit and change it. And we have another couple questions coming in, so maybe we can just quickly answer them. But right now, I may have a patient. I'll see the patient. I'll write, let's say for levothyroxine, which is a thyroid medication. They go to the pharmacy, and I write dispenses written for the branded version. The pharmacy tries to convince them. The insurance company then comes back to me and says, no, you have to get a prior authorization. You have to get an appeal. It takes me 2 hours. What role do the insurance companies have to verify the drugs that they are paying for are actually what they say they are? right? And then what about these hospital systems using these, you mentioned the Cleveland Clinic. In your book, you talked about the toprol and metoprolol, how they kind of found out that heart failure patients were doing worse. Ultimately, if these payers are going to become obstructionists, what role do they have in verifying the contents of the drugs they're paying for?
Okay, this is really an excellent question. So first of all, the insurance companies are trying to herd everybody into taking the lowest cost drugs possible, right? And it is incredibly hard to fight against that, either as a doctor or a patient. The problem is that the whole way our drug supply works is it's based on a central assumption that if the FDA has approved a drug, it's safe to take. Nobody is required to further test, to further evaluate or analyze, because they're covered by the FDA approval, right? The issue now is that there is no data available to insurance companies to analyze what the costs of these low-cost drugs are. I believe from all my reporting that there are real hidden costs to taking these low-cost drugs, right? The readmissions to the hospital, the patients who were stabilized and now are not stable, the heart transplant patients who wind up back in the ICU with organ rejection. But the problem is that there haven't been any studies to scale of what those costs are. So at the moment, all that the insurance companies see is they think they're driving to a lower cost solution.
So there's no outcomes to support the use of generic drugs, in particularly where the levels are important and the quality is important. Now, I'd imagine for something like, run-of-the-mill reflux, that diet, like Brian was saying, we can diet, hypertension, low vitamin D, diabetes, weight loss, we can do a lot with lifestyle. But when it comes to really severe disease, like our goal is to use lifestyle as much as we can. But
Right.
Both of us are board certified, and we understand that there are things that we'll never be able to do, and this is the miracle of modern medicine.
Right.
But then when I have that HIV patient and I have to trust that the generic is actually going to affect, their levels, their HIV, the levels of HIV, I have to become a lot more vigilant. When I have that patient with an organ, that's not theirs, I have to become a lot more vigilant. And, in the interim, until we can rely on these systems, which you've clearly outlined we can't, I think we just have to be more vigilant and just care about that person in front of us. There's no other way to do it. You're right. Maybe we need outcomes, or maybe, the FDA can just go and inspect, randomly inspect commercially available samples.
Well, that's actually what we do need. We need some sort of system of random sampling of these drugs. Now, there is this little online pharmacy in Connecticut where they're kind of been a disruptor because their business model is we test all the drugs we dispense. So they're actually kind of blowing up this model of just blindly trusting the FDA.
I want to know this pharmacy.
Valisure, they're doing it. They're literally doing it, and by doing it,
What's the name? Can you say the name one more time?
Valisure, VALISURE. So what they have done, literally by testing, they are the guys who found carcinogens in Zantac because they started testing that. So and their tests led to a worldwide recall of Zantac. So imagine if CVS or Walgreens or Duane Reade decided, what, we're going to be the pharmacy that tests. See, that's what has to happen. That to me is like the next wave here.
And then how frequently you test. Coming back to the supplements, I use consumerlab.com, and I use not-for-profit that actually verifies the supplement. So if I have a patient on a supplement, feels good on magnesium, or it needs vitamin D3, how do I know what the manufacturer says is in it's actually in it. I need a third party to verify, and Consumer Labs does that. I've also used labdoor.com, which verifies some supplements and vitamins. So if they ever go into it, but we don't even have that now. You're telling me we have that for prescription drugs. So I love it. I'm gonna use that pharmacy. I hope they're a mail order pharmacy.
They are.
Because I'm gonna use them. I don't know about you, Brian, but
yeah, absolutely. We have to know what we're getting and make sure our patients are getting the right medicines, and then, you know, hopefully get them off the meds as possible. And I think that's a hard thing is, look, there's good people at pharma, there's good people who care, and that, you know, they're bringing great drugs to market, but it's just such a hard thing. And you have to understand, a lot of this drug costs we're paying is because of the research and development and marketing and coming up with crazy names that no one can pronounce. And so I think it's really a hard thing. It's really a hard thing as far as, you know, a lot of people just don't care. That's the hard. They're like, look, if I could save a few bucks, like I'll get my shirt at a slave labor manufacturer because I'm not paying an extra $20 for a shirt, right? So it's hard. It's a hard thing where you kind of, you know, we have to evaluate what matters to us also, and what we hold true and valuable. And you know, if your life depends on a drug, you want to make sure you got the right drug.
Absolutely. We got one more question. So what are the top suggestions for patients to avoid, you know, potentially, you know, tainted drugs?
Okay. Because I got that question so often, I created a guide to investigating your own drugs and put it on my website. So katherineeban.com, more info, bottle of lies, more info, a guide to investigating your own drugs. And I outlined the steps that consumers can go through to see, you know, are their drugs working, not working? What are the steps that they can take? You know, there are some things that they can do, but for example, people say to me, well, how do I know where my drugs are made? You can't. I mean, you could be an investigative journalist and figure it out, but like if you walk into Whole Foods, you will have more information about where your apple came from than where your drugs are made, because that information right now is considered proprietary. So we need, like I have really been arguing for country of origin labeling for active ingredients and finished doses. Why shouldn't consumers know that, but they can't know it right now?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's a whole nother level of, you know, where the active ingredients came from, not just where the drug was, you know, manufactured, let's say, or put together, right? Yeah. If they're getting their active ingredient from, you know, an area that has less regulations, but then putting the, you know, pill together somewhere else, it's like a whole nother level of fraud. And the fact that we have to think this way is so tragic. But I think it just, you know, at the end of the day, Brian and I have to be more vigilant in the work that you've done, just like all the other investigative journalists and engineers we've had on this program. They make us think and they make us better at what we do, caring for the people in front of us. And I just have to say thank you for everything that you've done. I mean, this is a service to humanity. And I don't think people realize that. Like, you sit down, write a book, you know, but it is a service to humanity.
Well, that's really, you know, kind. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I know the risk you take, and we want to be respectful of your time, you know, because I know you have to go. But, you know, I just want to tell you, you know, Bottle of Lies, it's on Audible. I know I have it on Audible. It's on, you know, everywhere. I would suggest everyone listen to it because, you know, really you and some of these people put their lives on the line. This is a nasty, nasty area where it's very dangerous, and a lot of people have vested interest in not getting the truth out. So, yeah, I respect you for that, and I thank you. And so if anyone wants to get in touch with you, how's the best way to do that?
They could go to my website, katherineeban.com, and you can contact me through there. There's a contact form.
Awesome.
One last question before we go. Any threats? Have you ever gotten a threat?
Yes, definitely.
Like, wow.
Definitely. Yes.
My God. Well, keep up the work that you're doing. And it's just amazing. Everything you've done is amazing. And your book, please, guys, if you're listening, buy the book. Buy the book. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great having you.
Enjoyed the conversation.
Next time it'll be an hour and 20 minutes.
Okay.
No, we'd love to have you back. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to come. Okay.
Have a great day.
All right. Bye.